Hello and welcome. I'm Phil Naylor. Welcome to Tea with a Therapist. This is session number 3. So, first thing I want to do is a sound check just to make sure that people can hear me. I know there's kind of a delay in when people enter responses versus when I see them. So, if somebody could just say, "Yeah, I can hear you," that would be great. Not sure if anybody's out there. I hope some people are out there because I know that people do get the follow up link to see me on YouTube as well. So I'm going to assume that people can hear me, but if somebody wouldn't mind just saying, can hear you, that would be great. In the meantime, just let me introduce myself and what this is all about. My name is Phil Naylor. I'm a therapist. This is my tea. And please pull up your own tea and pull up a chair with your own tea and join me for this little chat. So I really am making this an informal chat so that I can share in an informal way information about mental health, wellness, and basically overall personal development. And so I do these every week at 4:30. This is information and just information and education. It's not therapy, so but I'm hoping that this kind of information is going to be therapeutic for people. So I'm not sure if anybody's hearing me. Anyway, I'm going to assume everybody's hearing me. So the topic for today, so each of these sessions has a topic, and these run about 20 to 30 minutes, so not to be too overwhelming for people. And the topic of today is anxiety. And anxiety I picked because anxiety is probably the most pervasive mental health issue out there. It's linked to all kinds of things. It's linked to depression. It's linked to addictions, substance use, alcohol use, any kind of drug use. It's a driver behind that. It's even a driver behind types of addictions like food addictions, video addictions, internet addictions. You name the addiction, there is anxiety, usually stress and anxiety very linked. And it is also symptomatic of trauma. So very much linked to trauma. As a matter of fact, the symptoms of trauma are anxiety, depression, and panic attacks, sleep disturbance, sometimes nightmares, and there's a high correlation between trauma and addictions or substance use, and high correlation with chronic pain. So if I see somebody in my practice who's complaining of, sees me for anxiety, sees me for panic or for panic attacks, for depression, if they also add in any kind of addiction or pain, chronic pain, then it's almost certain that they're struggling with some form of trauma. And it may not, most people don't recognize they have trauma because the effects of trauma happen sometime after the trauma, which is why we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, because it happens for a traumatic incident. And many times the trauma may happen in early childhood and is just not recognized as linked to anxiety. And I'm going to be talking about this a little bit, probably in another talk about trauma, because trauma is very central to mental health issues and goes unrecognized as the culprit that is actually behind mental health issues. So just looking at my notes here. So anxiety also underpins other kinds of mental health issues like OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorders, phobias, eating disorders. So there's all kinds of things that this is related to. It also makes worse any other kinds of mental health issues that people have, even things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. So if there's stress and anxiety, um, as well as these other disorders, it's just going to escalate those and make them worse. So learning to manage or learning about anxiety and learn to manage anxiety is probably one of the most important things that you can do for your mental health because it is like a fundamental. Um, it's important to understand what anxiety is. A lot of people, what is anxiety? And while they can kind of describe sort of feelings and stuff like that, but if you ask, well, what actually is it? What's causing it? What is it? Uh, People don't really know. So that's what I want to talk about today, because it's important to understand what this is all about. So anxiety has to be understood as both a physiological and a psychological issue. It's the two things. Because if you have anxiety, if you experience anxiety, which everybody has, you know that there's a physiological component to it. If you've ever had a panic attack, you definitely know there's a physiological component. You're physiologically overwhelmed. General anxiety, you might feel tension in your stomach, tightness in your chest. It can involve all kinds of other things, mental, mind racing, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, inability to be able to think well in a logical, coherent way. If you ever notice that if you're highly anxious, you're not in like creative problem solving mode so much. And so there's a physiological component to anxiety that we recognize. And there's also a psychological component because it is about how we perceive and think. So, so our thoughts and our perceptions feed and go along with the physiological responses. So if we break this down a little bit, the first thing I focus on when I ask about anxiety, the first thing I focus on is if somebody says, well, I have an anxiety issue, the first thing I'll say is, well, how long have you had the anxiety issue? And that makes it a clue as to, is there a causal link? Is there something triggering this? Many people say, well, I've always been anxious ever since I was a kid. So that is going to lead me to say, well, what was going on when you were a kid that made you anxious? Because obviously there's something happening that is creating anxiety. Talk a little bit more about the physiological aspect of anxiety. So anxiety is actually part of our survival mechanisms. It's part of the fight-flight mechanism. So it is designed actually to keep us alive. And how does that keep us alive? Well, it is the fight-flight mechanism is designed to mobilize our physiological resources as quickly as possible in the face of a threat or danger. So if we just take the kind of example of walking through the woods and the bushes start rattling, and first of all, you perk up and say, is that like my friend from the camp? Or is that the bear? And if it's the bear and it's an angry bear, then your survival is in jeopardy there. So it's threatened. Your survival is threatened. So what do you need to do to survive? On the most fundamental level, you have to run like heck or be prepared to fight that thing. There is a third response too called the freeze response, but we're going to talk about that maybe in another session. It's more related to trauma. Right now, we'll just talk in terms of anxiety. And the flip side of this is anger, by the way. So often people that have high anxiety also struggle with anger. And I actually deal with anger issues in the same way that I deal with issues. I'll talk about that shortly. But let's go back to the bear scenario. So we see the bear, we say, your brain basically is geared to just pick out danger. The lower parts of our brain, the kind of lizard part of our brain that's to do with just our survival. So the fight-flight mechanism, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, is rooted in the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is that part of is the nervous system that keeps all of our automatic functions going. Anything that's to do with keeping you alive, keeping your heart beating and your lungs breathing and your blood pressure regulated, all those sort of things that are going on behind the scenes all the time, 24/7. That's to do with the autonomic nervous system. Fight flight response is also to do with keeping you alive, but it activates just periodically. So again, we alert to danger. And as soon as our autonomic nervous system says that's dangerous or that's a threat, it says, I have to get out of here like now. And what does it do? It needs to mobilize your physical resources as quickly as possible. So dumps a pile of adrenaline into your system and cortisol, get your heart rate up, get you breathing fast, get your muscles tensing, and it's migrating your blood supply into your arms and legs because that's where you're going to need it in order to run like heck or fight that beast. And whether it's, climbing a tree or, whatever you need to do to get away, you have to be physically primed to do that. And so the fight flight response is geared to do that as quickly as possible. And it's not part of your conscious control, just like our heartbeat and lungs and things like that. It's not part of our conscious control. It goes automatically. It's in response to a signal from our perceptual brain that there's a threat or danger. Okay. Now, this is why working with anger is related, because the flip side of that, if you're trapped by the bear or something and you can't run, then your alternative is to fight. And that's when we lose the fear and we're going to say, you're not going to get me, I'm going to get you. And so that's the anger response that comes. So we might think of anger as the fight part of the response and anxiety as the flight part of the response. So now our anxiety is, it launches and enables us to do what we need to do to survive the situation. Okay, so now let's pretend that we survive the bear situation and we get back to our campground and everything settles down, everybody celebrates, and it's just normal. But now that you've had this bad experience with the bear, what are you doing next time you're going through the woods? Well, you're scoping for the bear, right? You're looking for any little sign of the bear. What's that? Is that such twig sound? Is that a bear? Is that a piece of bear fur over there? Does that smell like a bear? Is that a bear footprint? So we're looking out for the bear, because that's part of our survival mechanisms too. Because if we can, figure out when a bear is nearby and get the hair out of there, or get the signs of a bear and get out of there quickly, that's upping our chances of survival. So this is what we call hypervigilant. Okay, so once we've experienced a bad scenario with the bear, then we in a situation that resembles or is similar, it doesn't have to be a bear, but any situation that remotely actually reminds us of a bear is going to start to escalate our defense mechanisms. So now let's pretend that we're walking through the woods and we're in a sort of urban area, just little woods, sort of just on the outskirts of an urban area, and there are no bears. Okay, there's no bears for hundreds of miles, but we believe there's a bear. If we think there's a bear, what are we doing? Okay, if we're thinking we had that bad experience, and this kind of looks like when that place where I had that bad bear experience, we're thinking there could be a bear around here. Even if our friends are saying there's no bear around here, there's no bears, if we believe there's a bear, what's happening? We are physiologically responding like there is a bear. So our heartbeat is raised, we've got that clenching in our stomach, we've got adrenaline going on our system. And so the important point to recognize here is that it doesn't matter if the bear is real, like there's an actual bear right there, or if the bear is imaginary. So we just think there's a bear. So our bodies are just receiving a signal from our perceptual system, from another part of our brain saying, there's a bear. It doesn't matter if it's real or imaginary. Okay, so this is where the kind of anxiety, we start to learn about the anxiety responses, because it's partly responsible or higher. Most animals don't they all have a fight flight mechanism, but they don't have an imaginary ability. So we can imagine, you know, what could be. We can project into the future, imagine different scenarios, all those sorts. So that's the part that gets us in trouble. Animals will just kind of respond to what's immediately there. You know, if there's either danger or there's not. If there's not danger, they relax. If there is, then, you know, if they hear a few things that could be danger, they'll perk up. You know, but once they think danger's gone, then, you know, they forget about it and move on. Now, nowadays, a lot of our threats or dangers aren't necessarily physical. We're social beings, we live in a social world. There's all kinds of other threats out there that may not be physical. There could be threats to our security, for example. You know, what if I lose my house, and all those sorts of things. Our security is threatened. And there could be threats to our social well-being. You know, or what if people don't like me? You know, what if my significant other leaves me? All these sorts of things. There could be threats to our sense of self. You know, what if I fail at something? Okay. So all of these are different kinds of threats. They're a threat to us on some level, but they're not a physiological threat, like something is going to physically attack us right now. But to our bodies, it doesn't matter. A threat is a threat is a threat, and it's going to respond accordingly. It responds to a psychological threat in the same way as it responds to a physical threat. Okay, this is where we can get into trouble, because our minds can think of all kinds of scenarios. It mostly thinks of things in the future. We can imagine, oh, what if this thing happens? You know, oh, what if that happened? If you think about the things that make you anxious, it's about imagining things that might happen. Or it can also be reliving things that did happen to us. So if some awful thing happened to us and we keep dwelling on it, when we vision that experience, it's as if we're there again, and we have that same response to it. So our imaginations get us into trouble by being able to imagine scenarios in advance, remember things in the past, and bringing those things to bear. And all it's doing to our bodies is saying, threat, there's a threat here, there's a threat here. And what's our body doing? It's going, oh my God, it's the, heartbeat and the tension and all that. So the more that we think of threats, the more our physiological self responds. And we have the typical same response that we have for physical threat. Now, so we get to the point where we can imagine all these scenarios, sort of kind of low level of like trickle of adrenaline going through, ready to tense up at any time, bombarding ourselves, because we can go threat by what our mind is doing, and it's making our bodies be like this. And so what happens when it's like this all the time? Our nervous systems become habituated to that level of functioning. It's always like on high alert. It's always like hypervigilant on some level. And so we're always like this. So the analogy is like, instead of the bear coming and going, it's like, there's a bear circling around your camp all the time, and you can't relax because there's a bear there, and it's always a threat. So we're always sort of surrounded by a bear when we're anxious. There's always something that is threatening us on some level. So, so we have that physiological component. And if we are put into that situation of making our physiology respond in that way, it becomes the new normal. It becomes the normal way of its functioning. So if our sort of nervous system level is supposed to be at a level about down here, instead it's always like up here. Okay. And the analogy is a simmering pot of water on the stove. So if you got a pot of water that's simmering on the stove, just simmering. If you just crank up the heat a little bit more, it just will boil over. And so that would be kind of the parallel to like a panic attack or just being overwhelmed with anxiety. So we don't have much resilience in our nervous system. Okay, I can't take much more stress before it goes over the top. So now if you took that pot of water off the stove and let it cool down and became like a cool pot of water instead of the simmering pot of water, you have more resilience. So if you put that pot on the stove, you'd have to crank up the heat a lot higher, have to sit there a lot longer before it ever got to the boiling over point. Okay, so this is sort of metaphorically what's going on with the nervous system. It's simmering, it's on simmer all the time. And to do that, our nervous systems aren't meant to do that. And if it does it too long, it becomes what we call fried. So, so it isn't functioning very well with adrenaline and everything going on. So it becomes very difficult for us. So now that is fed, as I said, by the perceptions. It's the idea when we start to see this thing could happen and our minds go there, or this thing did happen, and our minds reflect back on that, and it keeps feeding us, you know. So all these sort of what if thinking, that's very common. What if this happens? What if that happens? It's not actually happening, but it could happen. So I mean, that's kind of a good survival strategy too, because if we can plan things in advance and anticipate the dangers, that's a good thing. But if we're always dwelling on it, like this could happen anytime this is happening, you know, that is not helping us. So our brain starts to orient towards doing that. So our psychological perceptions of these things that could happen, or dwelling in the past, the things that did happen, it is constantly feeding our physiology. And then when our physiology is kind of accustomed to being at a high charge level, then we've got a feedback loop that starts to happen. Because if there's nothing to worry about, our life is fine. Okay, there's nothing to worry about, but our systems are all jazzed up. What do you think happens? You know, part of our brains go, oh, I'm sort of agitated. What's going on? There must be something to be agitated about. I better figure out what it is. And so what do? We go start looking for things to stress about and worry about. And so we have this sort of vicious feedback loop. You know, our thoughts feed our body, feeds threat signals into our body. Our bodies are responding all the time. And then the fact that our bodies are always kind of more charged up, then that causes us to kind of look for more things, you know. And on top of it, it becomes almost an addictive state. We almost start to become addicted to the adrenalines that's in our body. It becomes the way we need to be almost. So let me just trying to figure out the time here. I don't want to go too far past. Wozy. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to talk too much longer because I am starting to extend beyond my commitment. But so what do we do about it now? Just do it very briefly. And what we have to do about it is that we have to work from both the physiological and the psychological side. So that's very important, because if you only work with one side of the equation, you're not fully working with anxiety. And when I help people with anxiety, I get them started on the physiological side first, because that is the fastest, easiest thing to do to intervene in anxiety. And that involves in doing a daily practice of calming, soothing the nervous system. Because if you look at this as an habituated response, or a conditioned response of your nervous system, if it gets conditioned in, we can condition it out. Now, often people go to the doctor and say, I'm anxious. And what happens? They give you a pill. And so what's the pill doing? It's affecting your physiology and suppressing some of those physiological responses. So that's one way of intervening. But of course, a lot of people don't like to take medications. It has its own problems and difficulties, as many people know. So I prefer kind of a natural method. But if you're not going to take a pill, you got to do something. So that means that you have to start to engage in a regular, systematic practice of calming, soothing the nervous system. And the three major components of that are: number one, breathing exercises. The number one thing that anybody can do as the starting point to manage your anxiety is to engage in regular, consistent breathing exercises, like 3 times a day for at least 5 to 10 minutes in consistent breathing patterns. Okay, and there's all kinds of, you can look up, breathing exercises and things on the internet. We don't have time to go into them today, but there's breathing exercises, grounding activities, and grounding activities take a little bit more explanation, but basically those are the things that when you engage in them, they may or may not be relaxing, what they are doing is calming. They're grounding, centering. So it could be as simple as, having a cup of tea, going for a walk, you know, talking with a friend, whatever it is that makes you calm down and settle. That's a grounding activity. And thirdly, is to engage in some physical activity that is aimed at calming, soothing the nervous system. And those would be like an exercise kind of activity. And those would be particular things, um, not cardio and stuff, which are it's good in its own right. So I wouldn't discourage that. But things like yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, things that are aimed at calming, soothing the nervous system, use a lot of breath work, stretching the muscles, stretching the nerves, working with the internal organs. That's the kind of thing that you need to do. So, getting involved in kind of a regular systematic uh, program, daily activity, I call it a wellness program that helps us physiologically to calm down. That's the important first step. Second step, of course, and the more complex part is working on our psychology, the thoughts that are going through our head, and to learn to manage those, because that's the other side of the equation that has to work. So we can't just do one at the expense of the other. We have to do them both. Okay. So that's all I have the time to talk to you about. I probably look like I will need to continue this discussion maybe next week. And because this really is important and it's foundational, and it's made kind of mysterious to a lot of people. Like anxiety is actually quite simple to deal with. It's straightforward to deal with, and not necessarily easy, because doing push-ups is simple. Can do 100 push-ups is simple. Get down and do 100 push-ups 100 times, but it's not easy, right? Simple enough, but not easy. Same as anxiety is simple, not necessarily easy, but not that hard either. It's about practice, getting good routines for your nervous system, and then working on the psychological strategies that balance that as well. So time is up, but thank you for joining me. My name is Phil Naylor, and thank you for joining me for tea. And I will see you next week for Tea with a Therapist. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Oh, and if you have any comments, if you're not live, you can certainly type them in to the comments afterwards. I will review them. I'll respond to anything that I see that hesitate to just make any suggestions for topics that you would like to hear about. Thanks very much for joining me. Bye-bye.